Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this book discussion on a virtual platform of the Observer Research Foundation. Today, we are going to discuss a book by Mr. Asanga Abeyagoonasekera, Conundrum of an Island, Sri Lanka's Geopolitical Challenges. I have with me four panelists. I'll first have Dr. Abeyagoonasekera speak for about 10-15 minutes, and then each of my panelists will give us their comments for about 5 minutes or so each. So I have Dr. Gulbin Sultana, who's an associate fellow with the IDSA in New Delhi. Dr. Smruti S. Patnaik, who's a research fellow also at the IDSA. Dr. Vinita Revi, independent scholar associated with the ORF Chennai, and our own Mr. N. Satyamurthy, who's a distinguished fellow and head of the ORF's Chennai initiative and a well-known Sri Lankan specialist on Sri Lanka and the Maldives. Now, before I start, I'd like to introduce Dr. Professor Asanga Abeyagoonasekera. He's the founding Director General of the Institute of National Security Studies, Sri Lanka, the national security think tank under the Ministry of Defense in Sri Lanka. During his nearly 2-decade experience in government, he has served in policy, advocacy, advisory positions, and expert panels, including the panel which compiled the National Defense Policy of Sri Lanka in 2019. I won't go into his various visiting positions, etc. He's a well-known writer and has been advisor to various governments. His major field of interest is geopolitics of South Asia and the Indian Ocean region. I had the opportunity to scan through this very enlightening book. And I think they are basically form a collection of themes which the writer has woven his narrative around this. So they launch off with the 421, April 21 terror attack in Sri Lanka and the issue of national security. Then he looks at the issue of China, BRI, and Sri Lankan foreign policy. Then chapter 3 is about geopolitics. Chapter 4 about sustaining democracy and facing a pandemic. Chapter 5 about the domestic political stability, leadership, and economic crime. And as we know, as we speak, we know that Sri Lanka is currently undergoing a major crisis of its own, but that is not something which we are here to discuss. We are here to discuss Professor Abeyagoonasekera's book here. Okay, I think what we will do is that we will have the panelists speak, and then maybe if things stabilize, maybe Professor Asanga can come back to us later. So what I will now do is to ask Dr. Gulbin Sultana to make.
Thank you, Dr. Joshi, and good evening, everyone. Am I audible?
Yes.
First of all, I'd like to congratulate Dr. Asanga Abeyagoonasekera for writing and publishing this interesting book. I consider this as one of the very few books on the latest developments in Sri Lanka. The starting point of this book is ISTA's under attack in 2019. Probably that was the motivating factor of the author to publish or write the book. But then he has covered all other areas, several other areas of security concerns of Sri Lanka, including violent extremism, Islamic extremism, and then security issues in the maritime area, cyber domain, as well as various non-traditional security issues, the governance issues such as corruptions, then the issues coming up due to undermining democracy and constitutional norms. So all those issues have been covered by this book, and I think that makes this book a very good a reference book on Sri Lankan security issues. I think so. Anyone wants to understand the security issues in Sri Lanka, I think that this will provide a very good reference book. And for my compliment to Dr. Asanga Abeyagoonasekera for this. Another positive aspect, in my view, of this book is substantial use of theories to, rationalize the arguments extended in this book. Um, and I like the way the author has, provided insights based on domestic viewpoints as well as relevant theoretical arguments made by various strategic thinkers on foreign and security issues. And also the way the author has compared the developments in Sri Lanka, Sri Lankan politics, and as a whole in Sri Lanka, and similar developments elsewhere in the world to draw a practical lessons. So that has made this book, I think, extremely, that has made the recommendations mentioned in this book worthy for consideration. Now, since I just have to speak for 5 minutes, I will not much talk about the other aspect. And if I have to give any shortcoming of the book, I don't find much. But only issues, I think, since this book is a compilation of several essays, I wish each chapters, instead of providing the compilation of the essays, it could have given a full-fledged chapter based on the arguments in those essays, so that it would have grab more attention and grab the recommendations and conclusions provided by the author. But that's not a big point. I think it's an extremely important and good book on the Sri Lanka security issues. Now coming to the various issues the author has already mentioned. What are the issues the author has talked about in this book? So I'll not go again and repeat those. But coming to the relevance of this book in today's context, when Sri Lanka is going through economic crisis, we all know what is Sri Lanka going through right now. So I would like to highlight some of the arguments the author has made in this book, and would seek, since the author is already is present in this platform, in this panel, maybe he can talk about how those issues he has mentioned, some of those issues, are actually contributing to the situation which Sri Lanka is facing today. So the first point I would like to quote him, while though those points he actually, this I understand this book is not so much on economic issues, though in some of the essays he talked about economic issues. It's a broad security issues he discussed, but still, if we can make some, relation, the as a whole security issues in Sri Lanka and some of the contributory factors he has mentioned in this book, and how they are related, or they have contributed in today's economic crisis that Sri Lanka is going through. Now, while discussing about terrorism issue, the author has argued that after a decade of the end of the LTT, I'm quoting him, another phase of terrorism emerged in Sri Lanka due to the liberal values introduced by National Unity Government that was in power since 2015 to 19. Then authors argued that the NUG tagged Sri Lanka to a global liberal order at the expense of an ensured demilitarization and the complete dismantling and weakening of country's military apparatus. Now, we all know that not only National Unity Government and even United National Party government in the past has followed the liberal policy, particularly in their economic policies, has followed this liberal kind of, shows their orientation towards the liberalism and all. So how this is my question to the author, how do you think that has impacted in today's situation? You have talked that liberal tagging the liberal global liberal policies have impacted the terrorism, the stress and the attack and all issues. So how do you see its impact on the economy? Do you see any kind of link? Because today, when we see the debate in Sri Lanka going on about whether country should go to IMF or not to deal with this economic situation, then we see a clear, debate is going within the country about this kind of policy. So that is my one point. And I would also like to seek your view on one of the arguments you mentioned in your book, and even in your brief today. You have talked about this emergence of the ultranationalists. So you have talked in the book, you have mentioned about this kind of competition between the neoliberals and the ultranationalists. So how that competition and the competition between these two entities within Sri Lanka are impacting the situation, security situation as a whole, and particularly in this economic crisis situation, then definitely I'll end my presentation there. Finally, on the China, I think that's an important topic, and you have dedicated chapter on China and its BRI policy. I what When we talk about China, and in fact, in last 2-3 years, we have seen, irrespective of the party affiliation, and other ideology, we have seen almost everybody within Sri Lanka believes that they don't believe in this Chinese debt trap policy, which is outside Sri Lanka, almost everybody talks about that there is a Chinese debt trap and all, and also how Chinese loans are predatory. But in your book, what I understood that you have echoed the others viewpoint within Sri Lanka, that that is actually not the case. The Chinese debt trap or the Chinese loans are not predatory. But now, when the economic situation the Sri Lanka is going through such a severe economic crisis, many people probably within Sri Lanka are reviewing their perception on China, because the way China is approaching or China is reacting, or to Sri Lanka's request to deal with this economic situation. So, we see some kind of reviewing of the Chinese approach, on a perception on China. So, what is your view? Because now you have talked. I think you have recently written an article where you have talked about China's strategic trap. You don't talk about debt trap, but you are talking about strategic trap. So, I would like to, you have mentioned that those issues, you have related those issues with the geopolitical context, and that, and you have dedicated one entire chapter on this geopolitics and its impact on Sri Lankan security. So I would like to hear your views, if you can elaborate some more on these issues. So I would stop here, and congratulations once again for bringing out the conundrum of Sri Lanka, particularly in the maritime power dynamics of the regional and extra-regional powers in the Indian Ocean region. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sultana. I will now ask, I think, Professor Asanga, because
Yep.
the thing was breaking, what I'm going to do is I have continued the discussion, and we'll come back to you. We have enough time for even the panelists may get another round out of this. But right now, immediately, I'll ask Dr. Smriti S. Patnaik, who's a research fellow at the MPIDSA, to put forward her comments. Dr. Patnaik.
Thank you, Dr. Joshi, and good evening to all of you. As I understand that this is a very significant book, as Gulbin has said, and one can understand from where it is coming from. The conundrum of the island is basically arises out of its own geopolitical location in the Indian Ocean, which has become a kind of hub of contestation, rivalry. One had seen that during the Cold War period, and it continues to be like that, especially after China's acquiring the blue water navy capacity. So Asanga's, has started his book from the Easter attack, which in fact was a kind of shock to not just to the Sri Lankan, but also to the world outside regarding this rise of a kind of radicalism And Asanga also has in his book dealt with this growing, ultra-nationalism. I think one cannot understand the growing Islamic radicalism without understanding the ultra-nationalism which is posed by the Buddhist nationalism, which is basically something which is harnessed by the Rajapaksa's brothers, especially after the defeat of the LTTE. So therefore, this entire the book mostly is written from the perspective of how Sri Lanka looks at its various challenges, both internally and externally. Of course, internally there has been a kind of pressure from India to resolve the long-standing Tamil issue, which the Rajapaksas have in fact ignored, saying that perhaps the government can look at the ethnic crisis in Sri Lanka through the lens of economics, and that is where till now you really do not see any kind of progress as far as the ethnic crisis is concerned. And understandably, India has been putting pressure. So at one point of time, it appeared the conundrum of Sri Lanka is that on the one hand, it wanted to balance India and India's pressure on the ethnic issues by bringing in China, and also trying to project the ultra-nationalism as a kind of new Sri Lankan nationalism. And one also saw that how in this geopolitical contestation at one point of time, Sri Lanka wanted to project itself as the next Singapore in terms of the hub of connectivity, or the hub of transit trade in terms of the oceanic trade is concerned. But also at the same time, it has not been able to really live to that kind of image which it projected, especially after the end of conflict. So therefore, I would say that in his book, he has tried to capture the various dilemmas, especially the geopolitical dilemmas of engaging India, China, and also the United States. However, these geopolitical, dilemmas have become a major challenge. One has seen how Sri Lanka rejected the MCC, the grant. It is facing an economic crisis. It is willing and, in fact, open to take more financial help from China, and yet it rejected the United States offer of, the grant component as far as the MCC, the Millennium Challenge Corporation is concerned. Uh, but I also find his chapter on the decline of democracy, where he has spoken about the rise of autocracy. I think probably the manner in which the war ended, and the manner in which the governing elite in Sri Lanka projected the end of the war, the rise of a new Dutugemu in the context of the Sri Lankan history, in fact, set many of the issues in perspective. So therefore, when you have a military victory and not a kind of political solution, and trying to look at the political conflict through the economic lens, so you also see a kind of decline of democracy, not in terms of, and this decline of democracy is not something I would say is confined to Sri Lanka only. You can just look around and see how the democracy is functioning in South Asia. But also at the same time, I think the decline of democracy also has seen the rise of national security state in Sri Lanka. Everything the legitimate political demand is also securitized. The question of autonomy is also securitized. So everything is seen from the security lens. So therefore, I didn't find it very surprising the manner in which the military was used to deal with the COVID crisis. Entirely everything was managed by the military. So after the current president came back to power, he has been using the military for various, whether it is the land commission, whether it is looking at, the various architectural kind of thing in Sri Lanka. So the military is heading most important, like for example, commissions. So the decline of democracy also was very much apparent when the parliament, really reversed the democracy, the democratic gain which the previous government has made, Sirisena government had made. with getting back the power back to the hand of the president. So therefore, these are some of the issues which Asanga has captured in his book, in terms of both looking at the internal political challenges and the external threats which Sri Lanka faces now. And I'm sure Asanga in future will look at some of the issues much more deeply in terms of just writing a book, especially the challenges of democracy, with you really do not have an opposition in that sense currently in Sri Lanka. So I'll just end here. Thank you, Asanga. Congratulations again for that very excellent book. And in fact, this fills in the gap of for the literature for the people who are focusing on Sri Lanka to understand the challenges which Sri Lanka is facing from the Sri Lankan perspective. Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Jose.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Patnaik. I'll now immediately go on to Dr. Vinitha Revi, who's an independent scholar associated with the ORF Chennai. She focuses a lot on the Indian Ocean region and the island countries around. So, Dr. Revi.
Good evening to you all. Thank you, Dr. Joshi. I really enjoyed reading this book, and I felt that you had captured very eloquently and very comprehensively the challenges of Sri Lanka. In some ways, the challenges of many developing countries that are caught between great power rivalry, while trying to also deal with their internal challenges, multiple internal challenges, whether political, security, development challenges. So how do you essentially balance all of these goals, all of these partners, all of these opportunities, and intensified with the global pandemic, and also the specific challenges of Sri Lanka as an island nation, as a small island nation, as that is also strategically blessed, as you put it. And yet it's tested also by these domestic internal challenges as well as the external pressures that it faces. And I think this, as the main conundrum for this island nation really came through in all of the different chapters that you looked at. I particularly liked, as Dr. Sultana also mentioned, the theoretical references that you made, where you draw from Mersheimer, from Stephen Walt, going back to Hans Morgenthau, Leviathan. And so I really enjoyed those bits as well. I think the panelists before me, Dr. Sultana, talked a lot about the terrorism chapter, and Dr. Patnaik, since she talked about the geopolitical challenges in those chapters. I think I will just restrict my comments to the sort of main takeaways that I had when, after reading this book, and, that I'd like to share with you. The first was, I think you really laid out very well this very intricate interconnection between the domestic, regional, and international, and that how we address issues and challenges at any of these one level will affect the others. And I think, and I think you advocate for these challenges to be well thought out, taking into account these different levels of analysis. And you make this point that it needs to be a rigorous process, it needs to be well researched, it needs to be well articulated. And, you say that this can happen in the form of a public national defense policy. In some ways, you say that these policies belong to the people and not to a particular regime or an individual. So it should be looked at constantly. It should be reviewed with improvements, with amendments, and not just, shared with a restricted audience. You also make this point about, how at a time of the pandemic, at the time of crisis, that having, a well thought out policy can reduce the anxieties, the uncertainty, and, could have created this stability, a sense of stability, not just for Sri Lanka, but also for the international order, as we saw. The pandemic was hugely destabilizing for the international order as well. I think the other takeaway, of course, was, and Dr. Patnaik referred to this as well, is, the importance of democracy and sustaining democracy. And this point, again, you make very well about the importance of investing in democratic values, democratic thinking, taking into account minority issues, genuine reconciliation post-war, and also larger issues like corruption, the rules-based order. And I think you also talk about domestically that the need for mutual tolerance between political rivals. And I think all of this tied also very well with the Seamus Heaney point that you begin with in the book, on the importance of building very strong foundations, building foundations that are long lasting, that are sustainable, and so that, even when there are temporary setbacks, the core is not shook. And the importance of doing that, and doing that through investing in these democratic values and the democratic thinking and so on. Finally, I think there was also, I really enjoyed the chapter on China. There's the geopolitical challenge, which has been talked about before by the panelists, that I think you laid out very well, this challenge of being caught between, as you mentioned, established and rising powers, and the need for Sri Lanka to embrace this non-aligned, multi-aligned policy, going beyond just what you see as the rhetoric. And you say that Sri Lanka needs to take a responsible role in doing this, and take into account, and again I think this was mentioned by Dr. Sultana as well, the need for taking into account all the non-traditional security threats as well. And I think particularly in the last 2 years we've seen how how destabilizing the pandemic has been, and that our understanding of security has to include all of these different aspects. I think, and I will end with this point. I think for me, the interesting argument in your book was that while I thought you argued for a sort of broad-based realist foreign policy that is very clear-eyed about the security concerns and the security issues, about the very real challenges that Sri Lanka faces, terrorism, given the Easter bombings, the multiple location Easter bombings, historically the largest terror attack that this island has faced, as well as the maritime security challenges that you go into great detail. I think your book, for me, was a reflection of how realist thinking and has evolved to accept that security has many dimensions. So even though you say it's important to look at these security issues, it's also important to broaden that perspective and really incorporate what we now call the human security agenda. And so that that there are multiple challenges beyond traditional security that can potentially undermine security as it impacts on the lives of people. And I think this was one of the central takeaways for me, that the importance of building and investing in strong structures that protect human lives, as you say. If I have a question, then this is it. I would, how do you see these challenges as unfolding? And if, what gives you promise looking forward? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Reddy. Now I'll ask Mr. Satyamurthy, Dr. Satyamurthy, to put forward his comments on this.
Thank you, Dr. Joshi, and good evening, everyone. Definitely, Dr. Asanga's book is an interesting compilation of his past essays, which are still relevant. But I have a few problems, and I have a lot of empathy with this kind of writing, who has put together the Sri Lankan domestic perception of security concern, Chinese debt, etc., which is seldom known, understood, or acknowledged elsewhere. So to that extent, I think that those aspects, I think he will have to develop in a bigger book, or take it to outside the country for people to understand what this conundrum is all about. I mean, the debt trap, or is it a debt burden, etc. I have a problem with the title Conundrum for a simple reason. As an absolute term in relevance to Sri Lanka, yes, definitely. But in most places, he has been referring to the past, present, and what I would call the template model the world over, and start checking them or testing them against the Sri Lankan situation. As one of my earlier speakers pointed out, this kind of democracy issues are there not only in South Asia, everywhere across the world. But for instance, we had a previous president in the US of A, said to be the greatest of democracies, facing similar problems and creating similar problems. So these are issues that have to be contextualized to nation and its environment and circumstances. We should not forget that Sri Lanka is the oldest electoral democracy in this part of the world. Two, continuously talking about autocracy. Most of you stop with Rajapaksas, which yes, there is a trend. What about J.R. Jayavardhana? Right? So then Ranasige Premadasa, who succeeded him. This is somewhere there in the nationalist mindset, I would say. So I would have liked someone like Dr. Asanga with a deep understanding and local conditions to analyze these things from a local perspective, not an international perspective. Yeah, I don't say they have to defend them or accept them or not. No. How? Why did this happen? How did this happen? And where do we go from there? And can we still use the Western model to evaluate various values systems in a third world South Asian country, which is a civilizational part of that growing democracy? So that is one aspect I have a problem with. But yes, on debt trap, I also agree with it. See, as we all seem to remember and forget at the same time, Hambantota was first offered to India. India did not accept for the reasons best known, in the sense it was not economically viable to the Indian assessment, as I understood. So it went to China. Otherwise, what if India had taken it or some other nation had taken it up? So, as Dr. Asanga pointed out, that Chinese debt trap is not the only reason for the present economic crisis. The Chinese debt trap affected them. I won't say that's why I said I share with you. It is not a debt trap; it's the debt burden. It did not create a single job in the past 15 years. That includes the previous government, which was non-Rajapaksa or anti-Rajapaksa, you can hear. They were there for 4.5 to 5 years. They also did not alter the Chinese scheme of investment, though they also took Chinese investments. So there is a lot of internal contradictions in that country. The previous government said Chinese debt trap is forcing us to hand over Sri Lankan territory to China. But in the same way, within months, if not weeks, they went and borrowed another 100 billion from China. And to what end? To lay more expressways. Such infrastructure provisions there did not make money to return the debt or even service it. That is only one part of it. As well as the other aspects, maritime security, etc., we need to understand, yes, China, because of the debt, etc., can influence Sri Lanka in a political way, which every government in Sri Lanka has done over the last 15 years. For instance, Colombo Port City project. The previous government, former Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe, before his election in 2015, said we are going to scrap it. Then he adopted it. Now, when it came up to Parliament for a vote on management committee of the board, his party very clearly, his breakaway party is JP, very clearly declared that we are for the project, we are not for the board because of its various specific provisions. Otherwise, also there is another interesting aspect. I expected Dr. Asanga as a local, as a Sri Lankan scholar to highlight. In the last 5-6 years, the two major political parties in the country have split. And the beauty is, the newer versions have survived and they are stronger than the original parent party. Namely, the UNB has given way more or less to the SJP. And two, likewise, we have the SLFP, which itself broke away from UNP in 1952, has still broken up under the Rajapaksas to found the SLPP of the Rajapaksas. This has been happening in other political parties also, elsewhere in Tamil Muslim communities in the past. And across the country, you see, no political party has produced a single new generation leader. That is another thing I would have loved in the case of democracy issues in the country for Dr. Asanga to highlight and bring out. To what kind of leaders are we looking at 5, 10 years from now? There is no clarity in the country. And so this is one area where academics have to, particularly people, policy thinkers like Asanga, can take up in the future. One more point, and on the maritime security, etc., I firmly believe from my long discussions with their political leadership, almost every political leadership, and their service personnel, whoever, that they have a standard plan, that is to keep off non-regional powers from this thing. As I have said in other fora, there was reason to believe that Sri Lanka and Maldives together seem to have decided more than a decade ago that for security they will have non-regional powers out and only India. That is the external security we can't manage. So we will have only India. And we have to look at, with that I will finish. China came with money back. Sri Lanka even purchased weapons, aircraft, etc., fighters during the civil war or ethnic war, as we may want to call. But it has not been included in any of their security arrangements other than a regular visit or irregular visit, port of call exercise, which is open to everyone. The specific security arrangements are only with India. Yes, 2007, just as President Rajapaksa, Mahinda Rajapaksa, was in Beijing, we had then Defense Secretary Goda Rajapaksa, now the President of the country, urgently signing an ACSA agreement with the US, ambassador. Beyond that, they are refusing to go to so far. So I think from an Indian perspective and also from a regional perspective, they are very clear about their security priorities, external security priorities. And I think we have to leave it at that and keep following it rather than criticizing it from outside. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Satyamurthy. That is a very useful set of points that you have made there. What I'm going to do now, we have just about 10, 15 minutes left. And right at the outset, we didn't get Professor Asanga because of the bad connection. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to allot him the time, because now he has the perspective of all our panelists. Now, in case any panelist wants to make an additional point in one sentence or two sentences, you're welcome to do so before I ask Professor Asanga to comment. So, okay, I think no one wants to make a point. So I will therefore ask Professor Asanga, please make your comments and observations. I think we are maybe if you speak for about 10 minutes, that should be fine. But if you go over 5 minutes, that would not be a problem. So Professor Asanga.
Thank you so much, Dr. Joshi, and thank you very much for all these observations, comments that you made from all the panelists. Very valuable insights. I think also to improve some of the areas that I have written already, but then needs more sort of I would say explanation on certain areas. I think the limiting factor is that of the to the capacity to of the at the particular time to capture the entire dynamics, what's going on in the geopolitical arena in the Indian Ocean, be in the region, as well as how do we capture all that. So that was a challenging factor in most of these essays. But let me go to Dr. Gulbin's comments, what she mentioned. So definitely, so you've looked at a very important area, which is what's happening right now, the economic crisis. Economic crisis is a serious. There is an insolvency issue where we can't pay our large debt. So this is highlighted multiple times in the book that we are borrowing so much, but then could we pay this? Could we? Are we could pay at that time, but then there would be a time that we will be unable. Or if the foreign reserves drop like this, and this is what happened in Sri Lanka, the liquidity problem right now affected the insolvency issue. So insolvency that we can't pay our large-scale debt. So you're looking at about 10 billion. So you borrowings from China. Then I write about the transparency of the loans of Chinese loans, the opaqueness of these loans. Now, a few days ago, China has given back again $1 billion. Of loan to settle their own loans. Now, this particular, even that I can't understand how you give a loan to settle another loan, but then in what interest? We don't know the interest. So this is opaqueness I'm talking in my book. And so at that time, when I was writing, so I mentioned about arguing about a debt trap. So there was a lot of debunking theories that there is no debt trap, because the volume of Chinese assistance or the loans were much a smaller percentage than the sovereign bonds. So I was saying, like, okay, that doesn't mean that the strategic dimension is not there. So the strategic dimension, which is the long-term dimension of China, looking at projects such as the port city, where they got the extra-jurisdictional right for many years, the 99-year lease. So all these have a strategic footprint. So back then, I didn't have a term for it. So I think soon after I finished the book, and a few months after that, I was revisiting my work, and I found out that, okay, this is a strategic trap. So I called it a strategic trap diplomacy. Then what I did was I encapsulated all those areas in my book. So what does the strategic trap diplomacy has? So there are three attributes. One is the support of China for human rights, which was clearly proven, where in this time at the UNHRC or the previous time there, China votes for Sri Lanka on the human rights issues, and Sri Lankan government for the first time you have reciprocally talking about Chinese human rights in Xinjiang, like defending their human rights. So the human rights concern is number one. Number two is the political dimension, where China funds the SLPP, the Rajapaksa political party, as well as the political dimension to alter the democratic, the norms, democratic values, and sort of move towards a semi-autocratic or autocratic sentiments to come in. So what you see is that Rajapaksa accepting, the last conversation with President Xi, saying that Sri Lanka should go for a different model of development model to his rural areas, for his political sphere. So the SLPP and CCP, I see the political dimension coming in for the strategic trap. And the third is the military and the security. Now, in the book, I captured the significant security footprint. There is a concern. So, such as the projects on the surveillance, on the what's the Chinese proposals, which was there at the Sirisena's table. So he was pressurized so much that to accept these projects, but Sirisena did not. But what made Sirisena go to China immediately after the 2019 terror attack? So the foreign ministry had a concern back then when he went to China. What did he sign? So even up to now, we don't know what he signed. So this is the concern that we have. And there was some signing, but we don't know what happened there. So why did he go to China soon after the terror attack? And there was a huge conspiracy theory on back then, before the attack, of an assassination plot of Sirisena, and which came from India. So this was the serious issue and it kept on sort of. There was pressure, the significant amount of pressure that was brewing, and it would go out of control. I think many researchers did see it. It's just that we could not help the process, and we were unable to help the process, and this was very sad. I think one of the reasons even the Indian intelligence did not get into the processes where it should have gone was the internal weaknesses in the system. So the dismantling, where Gulbin mentioned about the liberal values, there was a complete immediate dismantling of the security issues, like the securitization project, which the Rajapaksas kept on going in the northeast, various areas, as well as the intelligence officers who were being transferred. So multiple, I would say, interference into the security. Looking at it as a liberal project. So, such as there were requests from several international, like different countries, such as the United Kingdom, on demilitarizing in the northeast, various areas. So, demilitarizing should be. I know it's an important project to bring in reconciliation to a post-war country, but the national security is the key here, because here is a country which you have serious, what Smriti has really, she captured that. It's an issue that we have with the minority community for 30 years. We have an issue, the devolution of power we've been discussing from 1988, and India has been talking so much about. I think the Sri Lanka sort of going back and forth, where Rajapaksa say, no, we will give you 13th Amendment is where the devolution of power, we give you more, we give you 13 plus, but no one knows what 13 plus is. So the issue is the multiple promises that have been made. Then you have the ultra-nationalist forces. I think the centripetal force which came out of the 2019 the Easter Sunday attacks, where community try to get together. Okay, we need to come together, where the cardinal, everybody was actually contributed so much, but those forces were used for ultra-nationalist sentiments to come up again, where you were looking for a solution as a national security as the main theme, and where a leader is required, where a heavy center is required. So that's why I mentioned about the conflict between the liberal, the ultra-nationalists, where the importance of bringing, having a sort of a balance, even at the with the ultra-nationalists, where Satyamurthy mentioned that there were several other presidents who did have sort of autocratic footprint, but then having the military, 28 military appointments right now. So they are serious. So Sri Lanka is a rich democracy. So we need to sort of secure the values that we had, our contributions basically to the international community, such as the law of the sea. We've done so much as a country. So it's important to secure them. Having testing a different model, other than a democratic model, where military, with the military footprint growing, is a significant danger that we have right now. Now, military has been used. They're in the fuel stations right now. They're everywhere. So You have, I read the NGO reports, recently, which was submitted to the UN report. There is a clear danger there where it says that the surveillance is going on at a serious height, and we never had that sort of tension come into the NGO space, where the NGO space is taken by the Ministry of Defense. So these are areas that I think Sri Lanka should invest to develop, looking at other countries and how best we can, have the. I mean, it is important to have the security issues, but then again, how do we sort of look at it in a democratic fabric? So how do we keep that values? And that's really important. Vinita, also, of course, you mentioned clearly the issues between the domestic and the international. How I bring this to and compare it. And the concern here is that one of the best examples I can give is what happened right now in the Solomon Islands. So I've been looking at it and reading very closely about China and the Chinese security agreements in the Solomon Islands right now. So when I looked at it, I said, okay, this is what we had some time back. We had the same issues, because when the status of force agreement came to Sri Lanka, I remember we went through it as the national security think tank to give observations. So when we were told, so basically I was capturing what the Chinese, how would China look at this so far? Basically, how would the status of force agreement would be looked at from the Chinese perspective? And I remember the Chinese, the defense attaché in Colombo, he was saying that we have no issues with the SOFA. It's just that we might come up with our own SOFA, and please support us when we submit it. So that was communicated to Secretary of Defense. So these are all, I mean, I would say we are facing. So it's that the binary choices that I bring in my book, where we should not, I mean, a country like Sri Lanka should not be pushed to make choices between China or the US, where Yang Jieqi mentioned that you should be with us, not with them. Then Mike Pompeo mentioning that we should be with the US or with them. Then I bring in Ambassador Bob Blake, Robert Blake, who was there. I mean, a very senior ambassador. I mean, he captured it really, in a few lines, in that Sri Lanka should not be pushed into this direction. There are many middle powers that Sri Lanka could work. The balanced foreign policy, that's really important. The India, I mean, the concern of, I think, the bringing in what the India would, I mean, even the security information or the intelligence information were probably discarded because of the trust deficit at that time between Sirisena regime as well as India. I mean, so these are areas I think that we need to have significant improvement, and Sri Lanka would need to look at, I mean, India in a more sort of, as well as the other countries in so much of trust. I mean, MCC was a clear, the Millennium Challenge Corporation Fund, 480 million. We lost it because of a national security, argument, saying that there was a committee appointed. Then the committee came up and said that there's a significant national security threat from the MCC. We try to, look at this document and said, I mean, one of my art pieces captured that, so saying that there is no national security concern in it. There is no issues. I mean, where is the national security concern? But
Professor Asanga, can we terminate it? Just end at this point, because we have exactly 5 minutes left, and I need to get Mr. Satyamurthy to ask you one question. So of course, yes. I'll ask Dr. Satyamurthy straight away, and then you must conclude in another 3 or 4 minutes.
Sure. Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Joshi. And Asanga, one question. When we are talking about securitization, as an expert in the field, what do you think would have happened if General Fonseca has won the post-war presidential election of 2010? He was fielded by all the opposition parties opposed to the Rajapaksas at that time. So there is a dichotomy in the liberal perspective when it comes to issues like securitization inside the country. I mean, for the political liberals, I'm not talking about the rest.
Yeah, Professor Asanga.
Well, he came after in the post-war, where the winning general wanted to contest and win the elections. So where he mentioned about the serious lapses in the Rajapaksa regime, and I think it was too early for him to come at that particular time, because I think a lot of people knew who Fonseca was, but then again didn't know also what Fonseca could deliver back then. I mean, it was too. But the the military. That I mean, what Rajapaksa's played at that time, that election, if you could remember, was that there will be a military ruler, a military. That you are loving somebody to militarize the country, and they projected him as one of the kind of a dictator in the election campaigns, and that he would come in as a. So this managed to have a clear victory for the Rajapaksas, and so the sentiments of, I mean, even right now, I think the Sri Lanka would need to balance it. What's going on? It is a post-war country. The military, I mean, we had two youth insurrections, Dr. Satyamurthy. I mean, you know it very well. You've written about it, 1988, 1971. Here is a country right now facing a serious economic difficulty. And even back in 1988, that no one could project the insurrection. No one. I mean, there's not a single writing before the insurrection that an insurrection could take place in Sri Lanka back in. So this is the thing. So I think it's a Sri Lanka. It's kind of a boiling pot. I mean, you have these challenges, but then if you don't address it, I mean, you would end up in a serious security challenge, and it would spill to the immediate neighbor. So this is where you have now refugees going to India, but then this would definitely spill. I mean, if it goes out of control, but India would come to the rescue, given the first 2 billion, of loans, as well as multiple assistance. But India would also have to take the blame, also because of the devolution issues, the concerns that have been raised. But China would always say that they would not intervene with their internal politics or internal. So there's a clear line there. So that's. I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Asanga. I think despite the initial glitches in the internet, we have had a very useful discussion here. What we do plan to do is that we'll probably have to excise the initial portion where you made the comment, because it just didn't get across. It was somewhat disjointed. That's not a problem, because I think you gave us a very useful response to the issues raised by our panelists. I, as a moderator, didn't say much. My acquaintance with Sri Lanka really goes back to the 1987-1990 period, when I was with the Hindu and to cover the Sri Lankan conflict. But one thing I can point out, that from India's point of view, national security is a key question. When it comes to Sri Lanka, India looks at Sri Lanka from the national security point of view. Many people don't realize that when it comes to our shipping from East Coast to the West Coast, it must go around Sri Lanka. It doesn't go through the Park Straits. So we just see Sri Lanka and India as a geopolitically one kind of a space. And if things happen there, it does create waves in India. And what we have been witnessing, and you've seen how that happens. It's true that we stayed out of the last portion of the civil war. That was a consequence of, I think, Mr. Rajiv Gandhi's assassination, which had a long-running impact on the situation. But in any case, I'm not going to delay anymore. I have to bring this to an end by thanking each and every one of you. And I am sure the audience which will see it will value this discussion. Thank you and good evening.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
You.